Welcome to the Underclass Podcast with Austin Picard. I'm an independent researcher who can't stomach being lied to on a daily basis by the mainstream media. While we live in a fracturing society, launched into parallel realities, falling perfectly onto the two sides of the political spectrum, I remain in the underclass. Today, we thoroughly examine the birthplace of the 60s drug-fueled countercultural revolution, questioning the organic nature of an overall destructive social movement, potentially used to distract and discredit an entire generation of anti-war protest groups. Through exposing meaningful patterns, pointing to deceitful techniques of manufacturing culture in a covert, socially engineered psychological operation, we're left wondering if this could all just be an inconsequential aberration or the proof of sinister synchronicities providing context for a manipulated manifestation of cultural degradation. Oscar Wilde once said, "Those who go beneath the surface do so at their peril." And so the perilous journey begins, as we chart our course through the unsettled waters of historical revisionism in hopes of peeling back the layers of calculated deceit, relying on the common misconceptions of a nation consumed with worshiping the legends of celebrity icons. Our introduction to the Laurel Canyon conspiracy first begins with a quote attributed to one of the most influential singer-songwriters to emerge from the weird scenes inside the canyon, Joni Mitchell. When I first came out to LA in 1968, my friend, photographer Joel Bernstein, found an old book in a flea market that said, "Ask anyone in America where the craziest people live, and they'll tell you California. Ask anyone in California where the craziest people live, and they'll say Los Angeles. Ask anyone in Los Angeles where the craziest people live, and they'll tell you Hollywood. Ask anyone in Hollywood where the craziest people live, and they'll say Laurel Canyon. And ask anyone in Laurel Canyon where the craziest people live, and they'll say Lookout Mountain. So I bought a house on Lookout Mountain." According to an article at Vanity Fair, some say the Laurel Canyon music scene began when Frank Zappa moved to the corner of Lookout Mountain and Laurel Canyon Boulevard in the late 1960s. Former Byrds bassist Chris Hillman recalls writing, "So you want to be a rock and roll star," in Laurel Canyon in 1966 in his house on a steep, winding street with a name he doesn't remember. The Doors lead singer Jim Morrison reportedly wrote Love Street while living behind the Laurel Canyon Country Store. Michelle Phillips lived with John Phillips on Lookout Mountain in 1965 during the Mamas and the Papas heyday. Books and documentaries have mythologized and romanticized this woodsy canyon nestled behind Sunset Boulevard and the Hollywood Hills. Still, misconceptions continue. Laurel Canyon was originally developed in conjunction with the rise of the film industry in Hollywood in the early 1900s, providing an exclusive sense of privacy and seclusion in the center of the sprawling city of Los Angeles. Some of the earliest residents were Hollywood icons of that day, such as silent film star Tom Mix, magician Harry Houdini, Wally Reed, Ramon Navarro, all starting a consistent trend that has seemingly been followed ever since. Many of the estates that had been constructed at the time were known to have connecting underground tunnel systems as well as man-made cave networks on the properties. One of the most well-known properties was first built in 1913 by a real estate developer named Charles Mann and stood at the corner of Lookout Mountain Avenue and Laurel Canyon Boulevard. It was originally a roadside tavern called Laurel Tavern and has been described in a report at rwilliams.us as having over a 2,000 square foot formal dining room, guest rooms, and a bowling alley on the basement level. The Laurel Tavern, of course, would later be acquired by Tom Mix, after which it would be affectionately known as the Log Cabin. The grounds of the Laurel Tavern log cabin were also laced with odd caves and tunnels. As Michael Walker notes in Laurel Canyon, running up the hillside behind the house was a collection of man-made caves built out of stucco with electric wiring and light bulbs inside. According to various accounts, one secret tunnel running under what is now Laurel Canyon Boulevard connected the log cabin, or its guest house, to the Houdini estate. This claim is frequently denounced as an urban legend, and the tavern itself, as Gail Zappa would later describe it, was huge and vault-like and cavernous. Dave McGowan wrote in an article found at Center for an Informed America about two ambitious projects in the 1940s that brought significant changes to Laurel Canyon. First, Laurel Canyon Boulevard was extended into the San Fernando Valley, providing access to the canyon from both the north and the south. The widened boulevard was now a winding thoroughfare, providing direct access to the west side from the valley, and what would become known as Lookout Mountain Laboratory was originally envisioned as an air defense center, built in 1941 and nestled in 2.5 secluded acres off what is now Wonderland Park Avenue. The installation was hidden from view and surrounded by an electrified fence. By 1947, the facility featured a fully operational movie studio. In fact, it is claimed that it was perhaps the world's only completely self-contained movie studio. With 100,000 square feet of floor space, the covert studio included sound stages, screening rooms, film processing labs, editing facilities, an animation department, and 17 climate-controlled film vaults. It also had underground parking, a helicopter pad, and a bomb shelter. Over its lifetime, the studio produced some 19,000 classified motion pictures, more than all the Hollywood studios combined, which I guess makes Laurel Canyon the real motion picture capital of the world. Officially, the facility was run by the U.S. Air Force and did nothing more nefarious than process AEC footage of atomic and nuclear bomb tests. The studio, however, was clearly equipped to do far more than just process film. There are indications that Lookout Mountain Laboratory had an advanced research and development department that was on the cutting edge of new film technologies. Such technological advances as 3D effects were apparently first developed at the Laurel Canyon site, and Hollywood luminaries like John Ford, Jimmy Stewart, Howard Hawks, Ronald Reagan, Bing Crosby, Walt Disney, and Marilyn Monroe were given clearance to work at the facility on undisclosed projects. There is no indication that any of them ever spoke of their work at the clandestine studio. The facility retained as many as 250 producers, directors, technicians, editors, animators, etc., both civilian and military, all with top security clearances, and all reporting to work in a secluded corner of Laurel Canyon. Accounts vary as to when the facility ceased operations. Some claim it was in 1969, while others say the installation remained in operation longer. In any event, by all accounts, the secret bunker had been up and running for more than 20 years before Laurel Canyon's rebellious teen years, and it remained operational for the most turbulent of those years. By 1965, the first wave of bands would emerge from the canyon, with the new 60s style brand of rock and roll music, beginning with bands like the Byrds, Buffalo Springfield, the Turtles, the Mother's Invention, the Doors, Love, the Monkees, Crosby, Stills and Nash, the Mamas and the Papas, instantly making Laurel Canyon the epicenter of the new music scene, providing the birth of the counterculture and the hippie movement, even predating the infamous Haight-Ashbury that would quickly take form up north. A man by the name of Vito Pelicas had a group called the Freaks, often referred to as Vito and his Freakers, and according to Barry Miles in his book Hippie, the first hippies in Hollywood, perhaps the first hippies anywhere, were Vito, his wife Sue, sidekick Carl they all referred to as Captain Fuck, and their group of about 35 dancers. Calling themselves freaks, they lived a semi-communal life and engaged in sex orgies and free-form dancing whenever they could. Author Barney Hoskins wrote in his book Waiting for the Sun that the early success of the Byrds and other Laurel Canyon bands was due in no small part to the roving troupe of self-styled freaks led by ancient beatnik Vito Polikas and his trusty, lusty sidekick Carl Franzoni. The Freaks were basically a non-violent version of the Manson family cult, and had even been attributed with providing the hippie crash pad in Laurel Canyon that got the original group together that would later become the Byrds. Ray Manzarek, keyboardist for The Doors, was quoted saying, "There were these guys named Carl and Vito who had a dance troupe of gypsy freaks. They were let in for free because they were the quintessential hippies, which was great for tourists." Reportedly, in some clubs, Polikas and the dancers became as big an attraction as the onstage entertainment. The troupe, including several of the young women who later formed the group known as the GTOs and members of the Fraternity of Man, occupied the log cabin in Laurel Canyon formerly occupied by silent film star Tom Mix, and later by Frank Zappa. Vito's wife, Sue Ann Schaefer, ran a clothing boutique and is considered to be the person responsible for the introduction of hippie fashions worn by the self-styled group of freaks. It was later proved that Vito Polikas, the father of the hippie movement, was directly related to Winthrop Paul Rockefeller, who would serve as the lieutenant governor of the state of Arkansas. After the first big wave of Laurel Canyon bands, there was a shift in the scene. Instead of the emerging musical groups, there began a wave of individual singer-songwriters such as James Taylor, Joni Mitchell, Judy Collins, Carole King, and Jackson Browne. The next transition came in the form of country rock bands like the Flying Burrito Brothers, the band America, and also the Eagles. All of these iconic bands and musicians basically catalyzed over about a 2-year period in Laurel Canyon, showing up at Lookout Mountain, right where a top-secret propaganda production facility was covertly operating with fully integrated, totally contained sound stages and full sound production capability. Before we dismiss this as pure coincidence, it seems important to ask the most obvious question. Did any of the most prominent musicians from the scene inside the canyon have direct connections to the military intelligence complex? Jim Morrison, known as the self-proclaimed Lizard King and countercultural icon, frontman and lead singer for The Doors, was also the son of United States Navy Rear Admiral George Stephen Morrison, who is best known for being the commander of United States Naval Forces during the Gulf of Tonkin incident of August 1964. A false flag attack, providing a pretext for escalating the war in Vietnam. Congress quickly passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution as a response, granting the newly unelected President Lyndon B. Johnson unrestricted, unlimited power to wage war. The official story is that Jim hated his parents, especially his father, so he tried not to discuss them, even going so far as to tell journalists that his parents were dead. Although fans make the argument that he meant that they were dead to him symbolically, which could very well be the case. However, that doesn't explain the unusual picture of a happy-go-lucky, clean-cut Jim and his father on the bridge of his father's ship in January of 1964, 6 months before the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and almost exactly a year before the formation of The Doors. Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, written by Dave McGowan, is the ultimate source on this subject and provides the most compelling evidence for this case, including the flawless introduction to one of the most influential figures from the scene, in Frank Zappa. McGowan wrote, "During the early years of its heyday, Laurel Canyon's father figure is the rather eccentric personality known as Frank Zappa. Though he and his various Mothers of Invention lineups will never attain the commercial success of the band headed by the Admiral's son, Frank will be a hugely influential figure among his contemporaries. Ensconced in an abode dubbed the Log Cabin, which sat right in the heart of Laurel Canyon, at the crossroads of Laurel Canyon Boulevard and Lookout Mountain Avenue, Zappa will play host to virtually every musician who passes through the canyon in the mid to late 1960s. He will also discover and sign numerous acts to his various Laurel Canyon-based record labels. Many of these acts will be rather bizarre and somewhat obscure characters. Think Captain Beefheart and Larry Wildman Fisher. Some of them, such as psychedelic rocker, shock rocker Alice Cooper, will go on to superstardom. The log cabin was run as an early commune, with numerous hangers-on occupying various rooms in the main house and the guest house, as well as the peculiar caves and tunnels lacing the grounds of the home. Far from the quaint homestead the name seems to imply, the log cabin was a cavernous 5-level home that featured a 2,000-plus square foot living room with 3 massive chandeliers and an enormous floor-to-ceiling stone fireplace. Zappa, along with certain members of his sizable entourage, will also be instrumental in introducing the look and attitude that will define the hippie counterculture, although the Zappa crew prefers the label freak. Nevertheless, Zappa will never really make a secret of the fact that he has nothing but contempt for the hippie culture that he will help create and with which he will surround himself. Given that Zappa is by various accounts a pro-military, rigidly authoritarian control freak, it is perhaps unsurprising that he will not feel a kinship with the youth movement that he will help nurture. And it is probably safe to say that Frank's dad also would have had little regard for the youth culture of the 1960s, given that Francis Zappa was, in case you were wondering, a chemical warfare specialist assigned to where else? The Edgewood Arsenal, near Baltimore, Maryland. Edgewood is, of course, the longtime home of America's chemical warfare program, as well as a facility frequently cited as being deeply enmeshed in MKUltra operations. Curiously enough, Frank Zappa literally grew up at the Edgewood Arsenal, having lived the first 7 years of his life in military housing on the grounds of the facility. The family later moved to Lancaster, California, near Edwards Air Force Base, where Francis Zappa continued to busy himself doing classified work for the military intelligence complex. His son, meanwhile, prepped himself to become an icon of the peace and love crowd. Again, nothing unusual about that, I suppose. Zappa's manager is a shadowy character by the name of Herb Cohen, who had come out to LA from the Bronx with his brother Martin just before the music and club scene began heating up. Cohen, a former U.S. Marine, had spent a few years traveling the world before his arrival on the Laurel Canyon scene. Those travels, curiously, had taken him to the Congo in 1961, at the very time that leftist Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba was being tortured and killed by our very own CIA. Not to worry, though. According to one of Zappa's biographers, Cohen wasn't in the Congo on some kind of nefarious intelligence mission. No, he was there on the contrary to supply arms to Lumumba in defiance of the CIA. Because, that is the kind of thing that globe-trotting ex-Marines did in those days. Making up the other half of Laurel Canyon's first family is Frank's wife, Gail Zappa, known formerly as Adelaide Sloatman. Gail hails from a long line of career naval officers, including her father, who spent his life working on classified nuclear weapons research for the U.S. Navy. Gail herself once worked as a secretary for the Office of Naval Research and Development. She also once told an interviewer that she had heard voices all her life. Many years before their nearly simultaneous arrival in Laurel Canyon, Gail had attended a naval kindergarten class with Mr. Mojo Rison himself, Jim Morrison. It is claimed that as children, Gail once hit Jim over the head with a hammer. The very same Jim Morrison had later attended the same Alexandria, Virginia high school as 2 other future Laurel Canyon luminaries, John Phillips and Cass Elliott. John Phillips was another hugely influential figure, not only the founder of the Mamas and the Papas, one of the most commercially successful Laurel Canyon bands, but he also co-organized the Monterey Pop Festival and wrote the siren song for the Summer of Love performed by friend Scott McKenzie, called San Francisco, Be Sure to Wear Flowers in Your Hair. His father was a career Marine Corps officer, and he himself attended the prestigious Annapolis Naval Academy. His first wife, Susie Adams, was a direct descendant of founding father John Adams, and her father had been involved in what she described as cloak and dagger stuff with the Air Force in Vienna, or what most people call covert intelligence operations. Susie would secure a job at the Pentagon, where John's older sister worked for almost 30 years. Before John's successful career in music, he is reported to have arrived in Havana, Cuba, during the height of the Cuban Revolution, later claiming that he was only there as a concerned private citizen with the intention of fighting for Castro. After going over the list of Laurel Canyon royalty occupying Lookout Mountain during this time, there's one key undeniable factor. Almost all of them are the sons and daughters of the military intelligence complex. Stephen Stills, David Crosby, Jackson Browne, the list goes on, and even includes the group of young Hollywood actors who were a part of the scene at the time, filming movies in Laurel Canyon and frequenting the same clubs at the newly emerging countercultural hotbed on the Sunset Strip. The group was called Hollywood's Young Turks, and its members consisted of actors such as Dennis Hopper, Warren Beatty, Peter Fonda, Bruce Dern, Nancy Sinatra, Jane Fonda, Sharon Tate, and Jack Nicholson. Nicholson is reported to have had a foundering acting career before this time, seemingly being resigned to a career behind the camera as a writer-director, until finally achieving his first real claim to success after he wrote the screenplay for the 1967 counterculture film called The Trip, starring Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper, and shot on location on top of Kirkwood Drive in Laurel Canyon at the home of Love's Arthur Lee. The Trip was a psychedelic film centered around a TV commercial director named Paul Groves, who takes his first dose of LSD while experiencing the heartbreak and ambivalence of divorce from his beautiful but adulterous wife. Nicholson also co-wrote the movie Head, starring the Monkees, one of the original LC bands, and he also arranged the movie's soundtrack. In many of these cases, the actors who emerged from the canyon during this time seem to have even deeper connections to the military intelligence complex. Bruce Dern, for example, co-starred with Fonda in The Trip. His mother's name was Jean McLeish, making her the sister of Archibald McLeish, who studied English at Yale and law at Harvard, and he was reported to have been a member of the Order, Skull and Bones, the notorious undergraduate senior secret student society at Yale University, organized and managed by the Russell Trust Association. Archibald McLeish graduated in the class of 1915, 1 year before Prescott Bush was tapped in 1916, and he would become the 9th Librarian of Congress under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, holding the position for 5 years. During World War II, he was tasked to assist with the development of the new Research and Analysis branch of the Office of Strategic Services, a precursor to the Central Intelligence Agency. He also served as director of the War Department's Office of Facts and Figures, and as the assistant director of the Office of War Information. These jobs were heavily involved with propaganda, which was well suited to McLeish's talents. Bruce Dern's impressive connections don't stop there. His godparents were sitting First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt and two-time Democratic presidential nominee Adlai Stevenson. His grandfather, George Dern, was at one point the governor of Utah, chairman of the National Governors Association, and Secretary of War, also under President Franklin D. Roosevelt. If there were only one or two examples of direct connections to the highest levels of military intelligence, this theory would be far less compelling. But after diving into the research, it becomes quite clear that this is no accidental pattern. The final chapter in our story should be titled Dr. Strangelove's Workplace, in reference to the infamous Rand Corporation and the driving influence behind the character in Kubrick's film, Dr. Strangelove, How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. According to The New Yorker, In 1962, Kubrick was looking for his next project after Lolita and started reading intensively on nuclear issues. One of Kubrick's early ideas was to make a realistic thriller, titled after Albert Wolstedter's delicate balance of terror. But Kubrick could not conceive of a realistic scenario for an accidental nuclear war, so turned instead to the idea of making a comedy. The character of Dr. Strangelove is a composite of numerous people associated with Rand, but besides Wolstetter, included Herman Cain, John von Neumann, Werner von Braun, and Edward Teller. Albert Wolstetter was an American political scientist noted for his influence on U.S. nuclear strategy during the Cold War. He and his wife Roberta Wolstetter, an accomplished historian and intelligence expert, received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Ronald Reagan on November 7, 1985. According to the Center for an Informed America, it was not so much Wolstetter himself as his acolytes who had a major impact in Washington. Most of those acolytes need no introduction, as the names should be instantly recognizable to just about everyone. Richard Pearl, who once dated Wolstetter's daughter, Paul Wolfowitz, Zalmay Khalilzad, and Andrew Marshall, formerly a Rand economist who is promoter of the high-tech revolution in military affairs in Donald Rumsfeld's Defense Department, was dubbed the Pentagon's Yoda. In the latter half of the 1950s and the early 1960s, while Wolstetter was with the Rand Corporation and also a professor at UCLA, while his wife Roberta also worked as an analyst for Rand, Albert and his followers, the men who now serve as the apparent architects of U.S. foreign policy, regularly met in a heavily wooded neighborhood in Los Angeles, known as... Actually, I think I'm going to defer to the Washington Post's book review and let journalist Greg Herkin tell you how those bright, eager, and ambitious young men had sat cross-legged on the floor with their mentor at his stylish house in, drumroll, Laurel Canyon. In fact, as the pieces of this puzzle continue to fall into place, it is beginning to seem as though Dr. Strangelove's Workplace might be a good title for the entire damn canyon. We now know that, in addition to hosting both a secret military intelligence facility and a callboy kiddie porn operation servicing prominent public figures, Laurel Canyon was also the birthplace and meeting place of what we now know as the neocon PNAC crowd, as well as the home base of the guiding light of the Rand Corporation. The 60s counterculture and the hippie movement were more than likely weaponized to discredit the naturally forming anti-war movement that was becoming a threat to U.S. military interests at that time. And what better way to do that than to corrupt the culture of an entire generation, compromising them from ever truly posing a threat to the establishment? I always found it fascinating that the name Hollywood derives from the wood of the holly, which was the favorite wood used by Druid magicians for their wands composition. And in our attempt to break the spell cast upon generations, we remain skeptical, questioning the organic nature of an overall destructive social movement, potentially used to distract and discredit an entire generation of anti-war protest groups. Through exposing meaningful patterns, pointing to deceitful techniques of manufacturing culture and a covert, socially engineered psychological operation, we're left wondering if this could all just be an inconsequential aberration or the proof of sinister synchronicities providing context for a manipulated manifestation of cultural degradation.